October the 21st, 1899. The sun rises over the Natal hills, painting the kopjes in shades of amber and gold. A British cavalry patrol, having spent an uncomfortable night in the saddle, crests a low ridge and suddenly reins in their horses. There, spread across the valley below, lies Elandslaagte station, and it's occupied. Boer commandos move with purpose around the buildings, their horses tethered, their rifles glinting in the early light. The patrol commander raises his field glasses, counts the enemy, notes their positions on the heights beyond the station. Within minutes, a trooper is galloping back toward Ladysmith, his horse's hooves throwing up clouds of red dust. The telegraph wires will soon hum with urgent messages. A vital railway junction has fallen into enemy hands, and the British must respond. Within hours, an imperial force will march toward this obscure South African settlement, toward what will become one of the first decisive engagements of the Second Boer War. But here's the question that haunts military historians to this day. How did this attack succeed? How did 3,500 British soldiers, in a war where conventional assaults would repeatedly fail with catastrophic casualties, manage to coordinate a successful combined arms attack that drove a well-positioned Boer force from commanding terrain? The answer lies not in some simple formula, but in a complex interplay of leadership, tactics, circumstances, and mistakes. A battle that demonstrated both the potential of modern coordinated warfare and the brutal reality of what this conflict would become. This is the story of Elandslaagte, a name largely forgotten in the shadow of more famous sieges and disasters, yet a battle that deserves to be remembered. This is the story of one October day when everything, improbably, went right for the British Empire. To understand what happened at Elandslaagte, you need to understand what brought these armies to this point, to this place, to this moment of violence on the African veldt. The story begins not with soldiers, but with gold, with imperial ambition, with two small republics determined to maintain their independence against the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The Transvaal and the Orange Free State, the Boer republics, had existed for decades as agrarian societies, founded by Dutch-descended farmers who had trekked into the interior to escape British rule at the Cape. They wanted to be left alone, to farm their land, to govern themselves according to their own customs and their own interpretation of Calvinist Christianity. They were a hard people, shaped by a hard land, suspicious of outsiders, fiercely protective of their independence. Then gold was discovered. The Witwatersrand, the greatest gold reef the world had known, lay beneath the Transvaal's soil. Almost overnight, Johannesburg transformed from a collection of farms into a boom town that drew fortune seekers from across the globe. British investors, entrepreneurs, and workers flooded into the Transvaal, bringing capital and expertise, but also bringing demands. They wanted rights, political representation, influence. The Boers, led by President Paul Kruger, viewed these whitelanders, outlanders, with deep suspicion. Give them political power, and they would vote away Boer independence. The Transvaal government imposed strict requirements for citizenship, high taxes on the mining industry, and maintained control of this new wealth within their small republic. Britain watched this unfold with growing frustration. British capital drove the mining industry. British subjects formed the majority in Johannesburg. Yet the Transvaal remained stubbornly independent, refusing to bend to London's diplomatic pressure. In 1895, the infamous Jameson Raid, a poorly planned attempt to overthrow Kruger's government using a private army, ended in humiliating failure. The raiders were captured, tried, and imprisoned. British prestige suffered a severe blow. Worse, the raid convinced the Boers that Britain would stop at nothing to destroy their independence. The Orange Free State, previously more moderate, signed a military alliance with the Transvaal. Both republics began importing modern weapons. Mauser rifles, Krupp artillery, ammunition by the ton. They prepared for war. Through 1899, the crisis escalated. Britain sent reinforcements to South Africa. The Boers mobilized their commandos. Ultimatums flew back and forth. British High Commissioner Alfred Milner wanted war, believing the Boer republics must be brought under imperial control. Kruger and his advisers, believing war was inevitable, decided to strike first rather than wait for Britain to complete its military build-up. On October 11, 1899, the Transvaal issued an ultimatum: withdraw British troops from the borders or face war. Britain refused. The deadline passed. The war began. The Boers struck immediately, moving to invade Natal and besiege British garrisons before reinforcements could arrive from Britain. Their strategy made perfect sense. They possessed perhaps 50,000 potential fighters. Every male citizen was liable for commando service, compared to Britain's initial forces of fewer than 20,000 regular troops in South Africa. But Britain's empire could draw on vast reserves. Given time, hundreds of thousands of troops would arrive. The Boers needed quick victories, needed to seize territory, needed to create facts on the ground that might bring international intervention or force Britain to negotiate. Speed was everything. And in those first weeks, their strategy worked brilliantly. Boer commandos demonstrated capabilities that shocked British commanders. These were not conventional soldiers. They were farmers who could ride and shoot with extraordinary skill, who knew the terrain intimately, who elected their own officers and fought with initiative rather than rigid discipline. A Boer commando could cover vast distances on horseback, appear where least expected, deliver devastating rifle fire from concealed positions, then vanish before British forces could respond. They carried Mauser rifles that outranged British Lee Metfords. They wore no uniforms, dressed in ordinary farm clothes that blended into the landscape. They needed no supply trains because they could live off the land. They were, in essence, the perfect irregular force. British commanders, accustomed to fighting colonial wars against less technologically advanced opponents, found themselves confounded. The Boers weren't playing by the expected rules. They wouldn't form up in neat lines to be destroyed by artillery and volley fire. They used cover expertly. They shot accurately at ranges British infantry couldn't match. They refused to fight when disadvantaged, melting away rather than accepting unfavorable battle. Initial British attempts to engage Boer forces often ended in embarrassing failures, with columns blundering into ambushes or pursuing an enemy who simply rode away. Within days of the war's outbreak, Boer forces began investing the key British positions in Natal. Ladysmith, the main garrison town, found itself threatened. Mafeking and Kimberley in the west came under siege. The railway lines that connected these garrisons to the coast, to reinforcements, to supplies, became the war's strategic focus. Control the railways, and you controlled movement and logistics. Lose the railways, and British forces would be isolated, besieged, eventually starved into surrender. This brings us to Elandslaagte, a small station on the railway line between Ladysmith and Dundee. It possessed no particular strategic importance beyond its location on that vital railway. A place where trains stopped for coal and water, where a few buildings clustered around the tracks, where the empty veldt stretched in every direction. But in war, the most obscure places can become critical. When that British cavalry patrol spotted Boer commandos occupying the station on October the 21st, they were witnessing an attempt to cut Ladysmith's communications northward, to isolate the garrison, to complete the encirclement. The station had to be retaken, quickly, yet who would do the retaking? What forces were available? What were the odds of success? To answer these questions, you need to understand the men who would fight this battle. Not just the soldiers, but their commanders, the personalities who would shape the day's events through their decisions, their courage, their cooperation, or lack thereof. The Battle of Elandslaagte would ultimately be decided not by impersonal forces or inevitable outcomes, but by specific individuals making specific choices under pressure. On the British side, command fell to Major General John French. French was a cavalry officer through and through. A man who believed in aggressive action, in the mounted arm's ability to shock and overawe opponents. He was 47 years old, had seen action in Sudan and elsewhere, and possessed both ambition and a reputation for boldness. The opening days of the war had not gone well for him. His cavalry had struggled to pin down the mobile Boers, had suffered losses in skirmishes, had failed to prevent the investment of Ladysmith. French needed a victory, needed to prove that British arms could succeed against this unexpectedly formidable opponent. When word reached him of Boer occupation of Elandslaagte, he saw opportunity. Working alongside French was Colonel Ian Hamilton, commanding the infantry elements of the force that would march on Elandslaagte. Hamilton was a different type of soldier, cerebral, well-read, a veteran of Afghanistan and other colonial campaigns who thought deeply about tactics and military theory. He was also ambitious, though in a different way than French. Where French sought glory through decisive action, Hamilton sought professional reputation through competent execution. He would later describe the Boer War as a transformative experience, one that challenged many assumptions about warfare. But on October 21st, he simply had a job to do: coordinate the infantry assault while French handled the cavalry. The relationship between these two men, their willingness to cooperate rather than compete, to coordinate rather than interfere with each other's commands, would prove crucial. The force they assembled represented the best troops available in the immediate vicinity of Ladysmith. The 5th Lancers, resplendent in their uniforms despite the dust and heat, provided the heavy cavalry arm. The Imperial Light Horse, a colonial mounted infantry unit composed largely of Uitlanders who had fled Johannesburg, brought both mobility and a burning desire to fight the Boers. For infantry, Hamilton commanded the 1st Battalion Gordon Highlanders, Scottish professionals with a fearsome reputation, and elements of the Manchester Regiment. Artillery support came from several batteries of field guns. In total, perhaps 3,500 men could be brought to bear against the Boer position. Not a large force by European standards, but substantial for this theatre, this moment. And who held Elandslaagte for the Boers? The commandos occupying the heights around the station came from the Transvaal and the German Corps, volunteers from Germany drawn by various motives, some ideological, some adventurous, some simply seeking their fortune. Their commander was General Johannes Koch, a German officer who had volunteered to fight for the Boer cause. Koch was a professional soldier, trained in European methods, and he brought that professionalism to organizing the Boer defense. Yet herein lay a tension that ran through all Boer military operations. Their democratic tradition meant that officers were elected by their men, and orders were often debated rather than simply obeyed. A commando was not a regiment. It was an assembly of citizens who retained their independence, even in uniform. This gave Boer forces tremendous initiative and flexibility at small unit level. But it also meant that coordinated responses to changing situations could be slow, that grand tactical movements could dissolve into individual decisions, that a defensive line could fragment if individual groups decided retreat was preferable to destruction. Koch positioned his men well. The terrain around Elandslaagte favored defense. A series of kopjes, those distinctive South African rocky hills, dominated the approaches to the station. Position troops on those heights with their long-range Mauser rifles, add some artillery pieces, and you created a formidable defensive position. Any attacking force would have to advance across open ground, exposed to plunging fire from the heights, then climb steep slopes under continuous rifle fire to close with the defenders. Given the Boers' marksmanship and their superior rifles, this should have been a massacre. Conventional wisdom, learned and relearned in battle after battle during this war, said that attacking a prepared Boer position frontally was suicide. The only sensible approach was to refuse battle, to wait for the enemy to move, to seek advantage through maneuver rather than direct assault. Yet Koch's position possessed a fatal flaw, one that French and Hamilton would exploit. The kopjes formed a defensive line, but the flanks of this line were not secured. They simply ended, with open ground extending beyond. An attacker with sufficient cavalry could sweep wide, could get around the flanks, could threaten the Boer rear and lines of retreat. In European warfare, flanks were traditionally secured by natural obstacles or by connection to neighboring units. Here, in the vastness of the South African veldt, there were no neighboring units, no impassable terrain. There was just space. If the Boers had more men, they could have extended their line. If they had better intelligence, they might have known that British cavalry was available in numbers sufficient to attempt a wide flanking movement. But they lacked both men and intelligence. They held what appeared to be a strong position, and they waited for the British to come. The morning advanced. French ordered his forces to concentrate. From Ladysmith and from outlying positions, British units began moving toward Elandslaagte. The cavalry trotted cross-country, guidons fluttering, lances catching the sunlight. The infantry marched in column, weapons slung, keeping formation despite the heat and the dust. The artillery rumbled along the rough tracks, drivers urging their horses forward, gun crews riding on the limbers or walking alongside. Scouts ranged ahead, watching for Boer patrols, reporting back on enemy dispositions. Staff officers galloped between units, carrying orders, coordinating movements. Slowly, methodically, the British force assembled for battle. Imagine yourself among those troops, marching toward your first real battle in this war. You're a private in the Gordon Highlanders, perhaps, fresh from Scotland, having spent weeks on a troop ship to reach South Africa, only to find yourself immediately thrust into active campaigning. You've heard the stories about the Boers, about their shooting, about how British columns have been ambushed and cut up. You've seen wounded men evacuated back to Ladysmith, men missing limbs or blinded or simply broken by the experience of modern rifle fire. You check your equipment compulsively, ammunition pouches, water bottle, rifle, bayonet. Everything is there. Everything is ready. But are you ready? You joke with your mates to hide your fear, but the jokes fall flat. Everyone is thinking the same thoughts. Everyone sees those kopjes growing larger on the horizon, sees the sun glinting off rifle barrels on the heights, or perhaps you're on the other side. A Boer farmer, 30 years old, with a wife and children back home in the Transvaal. You've been on commando for 2 weeks now, have seen the British garrisons invested, have participated in successful skirmishes. The war seems to be going well. Your Mauser is a beautiful weapon, accurate and powerful, far superior to what the British carry. You've chosen a good position among the rocks on the kopje, with a clear field of fire down the slope. You have perhaps 200 rounds of ammunition. You know how to shoot. You've been hunting game since childhood, can hit a running springbok at 300 yards. How hard can it be to hit British infantry advancing in lines across open ground? You feel confident. The position is strong. The British will come, will be stopped by your fire, will retreat or be destroyed. This is what happened at other battles. This is what will happen here. You settle behind your rock, lay out your ammunition for easy access, and wait. By midday, the British force had assembled in sight of Elandslaagte. French and Hamilton surveyed the Boer position through their field glasses, noting the occupied kopjes, the rough estimates of enemy strength, the presence of artillery. They could see the Boers were perhaps 1,000 to 1,200 strong, outnumbered, but holding good ground. A frontal assault alone would be costly, perhaps prohibitively so. But if the infantry fixed the Boer attention with a frontal advance, while cavalry swept wide to threaten the flanks and rear, the mathematics changed. The Boers would face an impossible dilemma: reinforce the flanks and weaken the center, or maintain the center and accept envelopment. Either way, their position would become untenable. The plan was set. Hamilton's infantry would advance frontally, supported by artillery bombardment. French's cavalry would circle wide, screened by the terrain, moving to get behind the Boer position. Timing would be critical. The flanking movement needed to develop before the infantry assault reached its crisis point, but not so early that the Boers could respond and refuse their flank. Coordination between commanders, between units, between the different arms of service would determine success or failure. In an era before radio communication, when orders traveled by courier on horseback and situations changed faster than information could flow, this kind of coordination was extraordinarily difficult. That French and Hamilton managed it at all was remarkable. That they managed it successfully was little short of miraculous. The British artillery unlimbered in the early afternoon. Gun crews working with practiced efficiency to prepare their pieces. Ranges were calculated, fuses set, ammunition prepared. Then, on command, the guns opened fire. The crash of field artillery rolled across the veldt, the shells screaming toward the Boer positions. Explosions blossomed on the kopjes, sending up fountains of dirt and rock. The bombardment was meant to suppress Boer rifle fire, to drive the defenders to cover, to create the conditions for infantry advance. But the Boer artillery responded almost immediately, their German-made Krupp guns proving more accurate than British commanders had expected. Shells began falling among the British positions. Horses screamed and fell. Men died or were wounded by shrapnel. The artillery duel developed into a contest of skill and nerve, gun crews on both sides loading and firing as quickly as possible while under counter-battery fire. For the infantry, lying in extended lines waiting for the order to advance, the artillery exchange was a torment. You couldn't fight back, couldn't respond to the shells falling around you, could only press yourself into the ground and hope that chance would spare you. The psychological impact of shell fire is difficult to convey to those who haven't experienced it. The scream of an incoming shell, the uncertainty of where it will land, the knowledge that explosion brings death or mutilation with no possibility of defense. It requires tremendous discipline and courage to remain in position, to not break and run. Some men prayed, some joked desperately, some simply endured, trying not to think, trying not to imagine. Officers walked among the ranks, projecting calm they might not have felt, keeping their men steady through force of personality and example. Hours passed. The sun climbed toward its zenith. Men sweated in their wool uniforms. Water bottles were drained and refilled from the supply wagons. The wounded were carried back to the field hospital. The dead were laid out in rows, covered with blankets or their own greatcoats. Still, the artillery duel continued, neither side achieving dominance but both inflicting steady casualties. Hamilton watched and waited, timing his infantry assault, coordinating with French. The cavalry had moved out, beginning their wide sweep to the Boer flanks. They disappeared beyond the ridges, screened from the enemy position. Everything depended on them completing their movement, getting into position to strike. If they were detected too early, if the Boers had time to respond, the whole plan could collapse. On the Boer-held kopjes, Koch and his officers watched the British deployment. They could see the infantry lines, the artillery batteries, the obvious preparation for a frontal assault. This was familiar. This was what British forces had tried elsewhere, and everywhere they had been stopped by superior Boer shooting. The commandos checked their rifles, estimated ranges to potential targets, and prepared to repeat their previous successes. Some of the Boers, the more experienced or more cautious, worried about their flanks. Where was the British cavalry? What were they doing? But the majority focused on the threat they could see. Those long lines of infantry, those Highland and English soldiers who would soon be advancing into their rifle sights. The artillery duel continued through the early afternoon. A brutal, methodical exchange that achieved little beyond casualties and noise. But it served its purpose. It fixed Boer attention on the obvious threat, the British forces arrayed before them, the infantry lines, the gun batteries. While Koch and his commandos watched the frontal approach, French's cavalry completed their wide sweep beyond the Boer right flank. The Imperial Light Horse, dismounting from their horses, began to work their way forward on foot, using the broken ground for cover. They were getting into position to strike at the Boer flank and rear, to turn what appeared to be a strong defensive position into a trap. Hamilton, watching from his command position, judged the moment had come. It was mid-afternoon now, perhaps 4 o'clock. The sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, and shadows lengthened across the veldt. If they waited much longer, darkness would fall before the battle could be decided. If they moved too soon, before the cavalry was fully in position, the frontal assault would bear the full weight of Boer defensive fire without the relief that flanking pressure would provide. It was a calculated risk, the kind of decision that separates successful commanders from failures. Hamilton gave the order. The infantry would advance. Bugles sounded along the British line. Officers shouted commands. Non-commissioned officers repeated the orders, ensuring every man understood. Fix bayonets. The familiar command, the same in 1,000 battles across 100 years of British military history. Along the line, soldiers drew their bayonets from their scabbards, the steel ringing as it slid free, then locked them onto the muzzles of their rifles with a solid click. There's something about fixing bayonets that makes battle real in a way that nothing else quite does. It's a commitment. It says you're going forward into close combat, that you may have to use that blade, that you may feel it enter another man's body. It transforms a rifle from a tool of distance killing into a weapon of intimate violence. The Gordon Highlanders and the Manchester Regiment began their advance. They moved in extended order, not the dense formations of Napoleonic battlefields, but spread out, giving each man space, reducing the target presented to enemy fire. But they maintained formation, maintained their lines, maintained that collective discipline that made British regular infantry so formidable even in the face of modern firepower. They advanced upslope, toward the kopjes, toward the Boer positions, walking at first, rifles at port arms, officers leading from the front with drawn swords or revolvers. The Boers watched them come. At 600 yards, some of the more eager commandos opened fire. The range was long, but not impossibly so for a Mauser in skilled hands. The crackle of rifle fire began, sporadic at first, then building. British soldiers began to fall. A man would be walking forward one moment, would suddenly pitch forward or spin and collapse the next, struck by a bullet he never saw coming, fired from a position he couldn't identify. The randomness of it was terrifying. You couldn't see the individual enemy soldiers, just rocks and scrub and the occasional flash of a rifle. You couldn't shoot back effectively because you had no clear target. You could only walk forward into that fire, watch your comrades fall, know that the next bullet might be for you, and keep walking. At 400 yards, the full weight of Boer defensive fire began to make itself felt. Hundreds of Mauser rifles firing from prepared positions, from cover, aimed by men who had grown up shooting, who understood trajectory and windage instinctively. The British lines began to waver. Men fell by the dozen. Officers were targeted specifically. Their swords and their position at the front of their units made them obvious, and the Boers had no romantic notions about the impropriety of shooting officers. A lieutenant leading his platoon forward suddenly grasped at his throat and fell, blood pumping between his fingers. A captain, encouraging his men, took a round through the chest and died before he hit the ground. The sergeants took over, bellowing at their men to keep moving, to keep formation, to advance. But the advance was slowing, not stopping, not breaking, but definitely slowing. Men took cover behind anthills, behind rocks, anywhere that offered even minimal protection from that devastating fire. Some began to return fire, though shooting uphill at concealed targets was largely futile. The noise was tremendous, the continuous crackle of rifle fire, the shouts of officers, the screams of the wounded, the whistle of bullets passing overhead. Smoke from black powder cartridges began to obscure the battlefield, though the modern ammunition produced far less smoke than older weapons. The smell of cordite filled the air, acrid and chemical. Hamilton, watching the assault develop, could see his infantry was in trouble. They'd closed the range, were now perhaps 300 yards from the main Boer position, but the fire was so intense that further advance seemed impossible. Men couldn't stand upright without being shot. The assault was stalling, and a stalled assault meant defeat. Pinned down, the infantry would simply be shot to pieces, and survivors would eventually have to retreat, leaving their dead and wounded behind. This was the crisis point, the moment when battles are won or lost. Hamilton needed something to break the deadlock, needed some advantage to tip the balance. He needed the cavalry flanking movement to develop, needed it now before his infantry assault collapsed entirely. And then, exactly when needed, French struck. The Imperial Light Horse, having worked their way around the Boer right flank, suddenly opened fire from an unexpected direction. Now the Boers faced bullets coming not just from their front, where the infantry assault was pinned down, but from their flank and partially from their rear. The psychology of being flanked is devastating. A frontal attack you can see coming, can prepare for, can meet with concentrated fire. But fire from the flank means your position is compromised, means the enemy has gotten around you, means your line of retreat might be threatened. Koch's response was immediate. He began pulling commandos from his center to reinforce the threatened flank, to try to refuse that flank and create a new defensive line perpendicular to the original. But this movement, necessary as it was, weakened his main position. The volume of fire pouring down on Hamilton's infantry suddenly decreased. Not completely, there were still hundreds of Boers firing from the kopjes, but noticeably, and Hamilton, sensing the shift in momentum, sensing that the moment had arrived, gave new orders. The infantry would assault the main positions now, immediately, before the Boers could stabilize their situation. The bugles sounded again. Officers rose from cover, shouted encouragement, waved their swords toward the enemy positions, and the British infantry, those professional soldiers who had endured so much already this afternoon, rose and began to move forward again. The Gordon Highlanders, in particular, distinguished themselves in what followed. These were Scottish professionals, many from the Highlands and Islands, men for whom a military service was often one of the few paths out of poverty, but who took fierce pride in their regiment's history and reputation. They'd fought in Egypt, in India, in a dozen colonial campaigns. They knew their business, and now they rose from cover and began to move uphill toward the main Boer position with a determination that bordered on ferocity. The battalion's pipers, those odd musicians whose role was as much psychological as musical, began to play. The sound of the pipes, Highland Laddie, or the Haws of Cromdale, perhaps some traditional air that every Highlander knew, cut through the noise of battle, providing a rhythm for the advance, a focal point for courage. The Boers, seeing the renewed assault, poured fire into the advancing Highlanders. Men fell continuously. The front rank was being shot to pieces, but the men behind kept coming, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades, closing the range. At 200 yards, at 150, the Mauser fire was devastating at these ranges. Every bullet found flesh. But British artillery, having shifted aim, was now dropping shells onto the kopje crest, forcing the Boers to keep their heads down, disrupting their aim. And the British infantry, those who survived, kept climbing. There's a phenomenon in battle that occurs when attackers close to very short range. The defenders, who have been firing steadily at distant targets, suddenly find enemies almost on top of them. The psychological impact can be overwhelming. These are no longer distant figures to shoot at. They're individual human beings, faces visible, expressions clear, bayonets fixed and ready to use. Some defenders break at this point, their nerve failing, fleeing before contact is made. Others fight harder, knowing that the moment of decision has arrived, that it's kill or be killed. On the slopes of the kopje, both reactions manifested. The Gordon Highlanders reached the base of the main kopje, that final steep slope where men would have to scramble upward, using hands as well as feet, where climbing and fighting simultaneously was nearly impossible. There was a moment, witnesses later described it, when the assault seemed to hang in the balance. The Highlanders had come so far, had taken such casualties, but this last slope was perhaps too much. Men crouched at the base, catching their breath, steeling themselves for the final effort, and in that moment, leadership mattered. Officers and senior NCOs, those men whose job was to lead from the front, began climbing. They shouted encouragement, curses, orders. They waved their weapons. They physically pulled men to their feet and pushed them upward. And slowly, then with gathering momentum, the Highlanders surged up the final slope. The fighting on the crest was brief but savage. The Boers, realizing that their position was about to be overrun, had to make immediate decisions. Some stayed to fight, firing at point-blank range, grappling with British soldiers, using rifle butts as clubs when there was no time to reload. A handful of these close-quarters fights occurred, brief, violent encounters that ended with one man dead or wounded and the other moving on to the next threat. But most of the Boers, recognizing that the position was lost, began to fall back. This was the sensible thing to do. Live to fight another day, withdraw to fight from another position. The Boer way of war emphasized survival and continued resistance rather than pointless last stands. But withdrawal under pressure is extraordinarily difficult, requires discipline and leadership to prevent retreat from becoming rout. And here, the Boer command structure's weaknesses became apparent. Koch, trying to organize an orderly withdrawal to keep commandos together as a fighting force, found that individual groups were making their own decisions. Some fell back slowly, maintaining fire discipline, covering each other as they moved. Others simply fled, concerned more with survival than with maintaining unit cohesion. The withdrawal began to fragment, and fragmentation, under pressure from an advancing enemy, can quickly become panic. On the British left, the Manchester Regiment, advancing in coordination with the Highlanders, took their objectives as well. The Boer defenders, seeing the Gordon Highlanders crest the main kopje, seeing their own centre collapsing, began to withdraw from their positions facing the Manchesters. Within minutes, what had been a strong defensive line had become a confused mass of retreating men. The British had broken the Boer position. The kopjes, so formidable an hour earlier, were now in British hands. Soldiers planted regimental colours on the crests, more from tradition than necessity, and began to reorganize. But the battle wasn't over. It was entering perhaps its most controversial phase, the pursuit that followed the Boer withdrawal. French, seeing the enemy position collapse, immediately ordered his cavalry forward. The 5th Lancers, who had been held in reserve for precisely this opportunity, began to move. Lances were couched, swords were drawn, and several squadrons of cavalry began to pursue the retreating Boers across the open veldt behind Elandslaagte station. Understand what this meant. The lance, as a weapon, had been debated in British military circles for decades. Was it obsolete, a relic of an earlier age? Or did it retain utility against certain opponents? At Elandslaagte, the lance proved devastatingly effective, but effective in ways that raised immediate questions about the nature of warfare, about the difference between military necessity and atrocity. A man on horseback with a lance possesses enormous advantages against a dismounted opponent. He's faster, higher, has greater reach with his weapon. A fleeing man, trying to run across open ground, presents his back to the pursuit. He's vulnerable, defenseless, focused on escape rather than combat. The 5th Lancers caught up with groups of retreating Boers and drove their lances home. Contemporary accounts are difficult to read. Descriptions of men spitted on lances, run through from behind, pulled down from their horses if they'd managed to mount. Some Boers turned to fight, forming small groups, firing at the cavalry. These groups were charged repeatedly, cut down with sabres when lances broke or became unusable. The pursuit became a slaughter, pursued across several miles of veldt as the sun began to set. General Koch himself was caught in this pursuit. The German volunteer, the professional soldier who had organized the Boer defense so competently, was overtaken by British cavalry and mortally wounded. He would die of his wounds days later, a European professional soldier ending his life on an African battlefield, fighting for a cause that was not originally his own. His death symbolized something about this war, its international character, the way it drew in volunteers and mercenaries from multiple nations, the way it transcended simple binaries of British versus Boer. The scale of casualties during the pursuit was horrific. Estimates suggest that of the roughly 300–400 total Boer casualties at Elandslaagte, a substantial portion occurred during the pursuit rather than during the fighting for the positions. This immediately created controversy. The Boers saw it as murder, as British cavalry slaughtering men who were withdrawing, who were no longer effectively resisting. The British defended it as legitimate pursuit, the natural and necessary culmination of a successful attack, pointing out that defeated armies must be destroyed or they'll simply regroup and fight again. There's no easy moral answer here. War creates these situations where legitimate military actions shade into atrocity, where the line between necessary force and excessive violence becomes blurred. By the standards of 19th century warfare, cavalry pursuit of a defeated enemy was not only acceptable but expected and praised. The whole point of a decisive battle was to destroy the enemy army, and that required pursuing broken units until they ceased to exist as military formations. Yet the specific circumstances of Elandslaagte, men shot or lanced from behind while fleeing, the sheer one-sidedness of cavalry versus dismounted infantry, created a visceral horror that contemporary observers found difficult to rationalize. For the surviving Boers, the pursuit was a trauma that would be remembered and discussed for the rest of the war. They had seen their comrades run down and killed while trying to escape. They had experienced the terror of being pursued by cavalry across open ground with no cover and no hope of effective resistance. The experience hardened attitudes, contributed to the bitterness that would characterize later phases of the war, helped ensure that this conflict would not be a gentlemanly affair conducted according to agreed-upon rules. The Boers would remember Elandslaagte, and their memories would not be charitable to British conduct. Darkness finally ended the pursuit. The cavalry, exhausted and with blown horses, broke off the chase. Surviving Boers scattered into the night, heading back toward their own lines, carrying news of the defeat. On the captured kopjes and across the ground between, the aftermath of battle became visible. The British had won a clear, decisive victory. They'd taken the positions, driven off the enemy, secured the railway station. By any military standard, this was a success. But the cost of that success now became apparent. British casualties were significant. The Gordon Highlanders alone had lost perhaps 40 killed and over 100 wounded in their assault on the main kopje. The Manchester Regiment, the Sasa, Imperial Light Horse, other units, all had paid in blood. Total British casualties exceeded 200 men killed and wounded, perhaps closer to 250 when final counts were made. These were professional soldiers, expensively trained, difficult to replace immediately. Each casualty represented not just a tragedy for family and friends, but a reduction in British military capability in theatre. Boer casualties were far worse. Beyond the 300–400 killed and wounded, perhaps another 200 Boers were captured, taken prisoner during or after the battle. These prisoners presented an immediate problem for the British. Where would they be held? How would they be guarded? What would be done with them? The whole British military apparatus in South Africa was still gearing up for major war, and the logistics of prisoner handling hadn't been fully developed. Many of the captured Boers were sent to Ladysmith initially, though later they'd be shipped to prison camps elsewhere in South Africa or even overseas. As darkness fell completely, the battlefield became a scene of almost medieval horror, illuminated by lanterns and torches. The medical services, such as they were, began their grim work. British Army medical care in 1899 was better than it had been in previous wars. The Boer War would see extensive use of professional nurses, of hospital trains, of relatively modern surgical techniques. But battlefield medicine still meant operations performed without proper anesthesia, meant amputations to prevent gangrene, meant men dying of wounds that modern medicine could easily treat. The wounded lay in rows, waiting their turn with the surgeons. Those judged too severely wounded to survive were made comfortable and given laudanum for the pain. The screaming of wounded men, British and Boer alike, continued through much of the night. Burial details began their work as well. British dead were gathered, identified where possible, and buried in mass graves with brief Anglican services. Boer dead received less formal treatment initially, though British officers generally tried to ensure that enemy dead were buried respectfully. There's something about victory that allows generosity toward the defeated, and British soldiers, having won, could afford to be gracious. Later, proper cemeteries would be established, individual graves marked. But on the night of October 21st, speed mattered more than dignity. Bodies had to be buried before they began to decompose in the African heat. The soldiers who had done the fighting, who had survived, collapsed in exhaustion. They'd been awake since before dawn, had marched, had fought through hours of combat, had experienced terror and violence, and had somehow survived. Now, with the adrenaline fading, the psychological and physical toll became apparent. Men shook with reaction. Some vomited, some wept, some simply stared into space, unable to process what they'd experienced. The veterans, those who had seen combat before, helped the newer soldiers cope, offered words of encouragement, or simply sat with them in companionable silence. This, too, was part of battle's aftermath. Not just the physical casualties, but the psychological wounds that wouldn't show on any casualty list. Officers moved among the troops, checking on the men, ensuring sentries were posted, organizing the defensive positions that would be occupied overnight. There was no guarantee that the Boers wouldn't counterattack, no certainty that larger Boer forces weren't approaching. The British would hold the captured positions, would maintain vigilance, would be ready to fight again if necessary. Ammunition was redistributed from the dead to the living. Water bottles were refilled. Field kitchens began preparing food, the first hot meal many men had eaten all day. The mundane necessities of military life continued even in the immediate aftermath of battle. French and Hamilton met to assess the day's results. They had achieved their objective. The railway station was retaken, the Boer force defeated and scattered. The coordination between cavalry and infantry had worked. The combined arms approach had succeeded. This was the kind of victory that British arms needed, that would boost morale throughout the army in South Africa. Messages were prepared for transmission back to Ladysmith and onward to higher headquarters. The telegraph wires, so recently cut by the Boers, would soon carry news of British success. Yet both commanders understood that Elandslaagte, significant as it was, represented only a small tactical victory in what was shaping up to be a much larger war. The Boers had lost perhaps 1,000 men here, killed, wounded, or captured. But they had tens of thousands more. They still besieged Ladysmith. They still controlled much of the Transvaal and Orange Free State. One battle, even a decisive one, wouldn't end this war, and already, even in victory, some disturbing lessons were apparent. British casualties had been substantial for the result achieved. The Boer withdrawal, though ultimately successful for British purposes, had required a cavalry pursuit that raised moral questions. The sheer difficulty of coordinating the different arms of service, of maintaining command and control, of executing a complex plan under battle conditions, all of this suggested that future operations would be challenging. For the Boer survivors, straggling back toward to their own lines through the darkness, the experience of Elandslaagte was searing. They had been defeated, driven from strong positions, pursued, and in some cases hunted down by British cavalry. The humiliation mixed with fear and anger. Their confidence, built up through the first weeks of the war, had been badly shaken. They had learned that British forces, properly led and coordinated, could defeat them in open battle. The myth of Boer invincibility, if it had ever existed, was shattered. But more than that, they had learned that this war would be fought with a brutality that perhaps they hadn't fully anticipated. The cavalry pursuit, in particular, would be remembered and recounted, would feed into Boer perceptions of British barbarism, would justify, in their own minds, increasingly harsh measures as the war progressed. The railway station itself, the ostensible objective of the day's fighting, sat quiet in the darkness. A few buildings, a water tower, lengths of track gleaming in the moonlight. Nothing that seemed worth the hundreds of casualties expended to capture it. Yet wars are fought for such objectives, for the mundane strategic necessities that connect to larger purposes. The railway connected Ladysmith to the north, to Dundee, to the coal supplies that powered the locomotives that moved the supplies that kept armies in the field. Lose the railway, and operations became impossible. Hold the railway, and you maintain the ability to maneuver, to concentrate forces, to respond to enemy threats. So men died for a railway station in the middle of nowhere, and their deaths had strategic meaning even if any individual casualty seemed pointless. By midnight, the battlefield had quieted. The wounded who could be helped had been treated. The dead had been buried or laid out for burial at first light. The soldiers slept where they could, wrapped in their greatcoats, using their packs as pillows, rifles close at hand. Sentries paced their posts, peering into the darkness, listening for sounds of enemy movement. The kopjes, sites of such violence only hours earlier, now stood silent under the stars. The African night, indifferent to human violence, continued its ancient patterns. And the men who had fought for those kopjes slept the sleep of exhaustion, of trauma survived, of another day lived through in a war that was only beginning. The morning of October 22nd broke clear and cool over Elandslaagte. The aftermath of battle revealed itself in harsh sunlight. The scattered equipment, the bloodstains on rocks, the shallow graves marked with improvised crosses or cairns of stones. British soldiers stirred, stiff and sore, to begin another day of soldiering, but the nature of that soldiering had changed. Yesterday they had been attacking. Today they were occupying, consolidating, dealing with the consequences of victory. The full scope of what had been achieved and what it had cost became clearer in daylight. Walking the battlefield, you could trace the course of the action. Here, the lines where British infantry had lain under artillery fire, the ground scarred by shell impacts. There, the slopes they had climbed under rifle fire, marked by spent cartridge cases and dried blood. On the crest of the main kopje, the positions where Boers had fought and died, where the brief hand-to-hand combat had occurred. And beyond, across the veldt, the scattered evidence of the pursuit, bodies lying in the grass, abandoned equipment, dead horses. British work parties began the grim task of policing the battlefield more thoroughly than had been possible in darkness. Every weapon had to be collected, both for intelligence purposes and to prevent them falling back into enemy hands. Boer Mausers were particularly prized, superior in many ways to British Lee Metfords. Ammunition was gathered, sorted, redistributed. Documents found on dead or captured Boers were sent to intelligence officers for analysis. Personal effects were collected for eventual return to families, though this humanitarian gesture would often fail in practice. The chaos of war, the distances involved, the bitter feelings on both sides all conspired against such courtesies. The wounded presented ongoing challenges. Those who could be moved were evacuated to Ladysmith by train, the railway that had been the battle's objective now serving its purpose, carrying British wounded back to better medical facilities. But many wounded couldn't be moved immediately. They required further surgery, stabilization, nursing care before transport was advisable. Field hospitals remained in operation around Elandslaagte for days, makeshift medical facilities where surgeons worked to save lives with limited resources. The mortality rate among the seriously wounded remained high. Infection, shock, blood loss all claimed victims who might have survived with modern medical care. For the Boer wounded and prisoners, the situation was more complicated. They were enemies, certainly, but they were also human beings requiring medical care. British medical personnel, operating under the conventions of war as then understood, treated Boer wounded alongside British casualties. This sometimes created strange scenes, men who had been trying to kill each other hours earlier, now lying side by side in hospital tents, receiving care from the same doctors and nurses. Some Boer wounded expressed gratitude. Others remained hostile, bitter about their defeat and captivity. The British medical staff, for the most part, simply did their jobs, treating whoever needed treatment, regardless of uniform or allegiance. The prisoners themselves, perhaps 200 Boers captured during or after the battle, posed logistical and political problems. These weren't professional soldiers who understood the conventions of military captivity. They were farmers, citizens of republics that Britain didn't recognize as legitimate, fighting what they considered a defensive war against imperial aggression. Many refused to give parole, refused to promise not to fight again if released. This meant they had to be guarded closely, eventually transported to prison camps. The handling of these prisoners, their conditions of captivity, their ultimate fate, all would contribute to the growing bitterness of the war. News of the victory spread rapidly through British forces in South Africa. For troops who had experienced mostly setbacks and frustrations in the war's opening weeks, Elandslaagte represented proof that the Boers could be beaten, that British military methods could work if properly applied. Morale improved noticeably. The psychological impact of a clear victory cannot be overstated. It restored confidence, suggested that the situation was not hopeless, demonstrated that courage and discipline could overcome even well-entrenched defenders with superior rifles. But even in victory, there were disturbing undercurrents. The controversy over the cavalry pursuit began almost immediately. British officers defended the action as militarily necessary. A defeated enemy must be pursued to prevent regrouping. Some even argued that the pursuit had been insufficiently vigorous, that more Boers should have been killed or captured. But others, including some who had participated in the battle, expressed unease about what had occurred. Letters home mentioned the pursuit with ambivalence or outright distress. The image of lancers running down fleeing men troubled some British soldiers, even as they defended the overall action as justified. The Boers, naturally, saw the matter quite differently. Survivors of Elandslaagte carried stories of British atrocities back to their commandos. The cavalry pursuit became, in Boer telling, a massacre of men trying to surrender or withdraw honorably. Whether these accounts were entirely accurate or colored by the trauma and humiliation of defeat is difficult to determine at this distance. Probably elements of both. War creates narratives, and each side constructs stories that justify their actions and demonize their enemies. The pursuit at Elandslaagte gave Boers a story of British brutality that would be retold, embellished, used to justify their own harsh measures later in the war. From a purely tactical perspective, Elandslaagte offered valuable lessons for military analysts. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms warfare when properly coordinated. The artillery preparation had suppressed Boer defensive fire sufficiently to enable the infantry advance. The infantry assault had fixed enemy attention and prevented repositioning. The cavalry flanking movement had created the decisive crisis that broke the Boer position. Each element had contributed to success, and the coordination between them, between French and Hamilton, between different units and different arms of service, had been crucial. The importance of aggressive, coordinated command was another lesson. French and Hamilton had worked together effectively, subordinating personal rivalry or service parochialism to the common objective. They had developed a clear plan before the battle and executed it despite the chaos and confusion of combat. They had timed their movements well, ensuring that the flanking attack developed at the critical moment. This kind of coordination was rare in the Boer War, would prove difficult to replicate in subsequent battles. The tactical use of terrain also merited study. The Boers had occupied strong ground, But their position had fatal weaknesses. The flanks were vulnerable, and British commanders had recognized this. The lesson was that static defense, however strong it appeared, could be outmaneuvered by a mobile enemy with sufficient forces. This should have suggested to military thinkers that the nature of warfare was changing, that defense without depth and without the ability to maneuver was increasingly vulnerable. But lessons learned in one battle are often forgotten in the next, and the British would repeatedly have to relearn these principles throughout the war. The effectiveness of modern firepower was starkly demonstrated. The casualties inflicted by Boer rifle fire during the British advance were substantial, achieved from concealed positions at ranges where the British couldn't effectively return fire. This foreshadowed the dominance of defensive firepower that would characterize World War I. The lesson should have been that attacking prepared positions frontally was prohibitively costly, that success required either overwhelming numerical superiority or tactical innovation, like the flanking movement at Elandslaagte. Yet British commanders would continue to order frontal assaults throughout the Boer War, often with catastrophic results. The vulnerability of cavalry to rifle fire also became apparent. French's cavalry had been crucial to victory, but only because they'd been used intelligently, for maneuver and pursuit rather than for direct assault on prepared positions. Attempts to charge entrenched riflemen with cavalry would fail repeatedly throughout the war. The romantic image of cavalry charging home with lance and saber was increasingly obsolete in the face of magazine-fed rifles. Yet the cavalry arm, both in Britain and other European armies, would resist this conclusion, would continue to argue for the relevance of mounted shock action even as technological change made such tactics suicidal. For the Boers, Elandslaagte exposed weaknesses in their own military system. Their democratic command structure, while fostering initiative at small unit level, made coordinated responses to enemy maneuvers difficult. When the British flanking movement developed, Koch couldn't simply order commandos to redeploy. He had to persuade, had to argue, had to accept that some groups would make their own decisions. This worked well enough in defensive or guerrilla operations where individual initiative was more important than large-scale coordination. But in a conventional battle requiring rapid redeployment of forces, it was a serious liability. The Boer decision to occupy static positions rather than maintain mobility had also proven costly. The Boers' greatest advantages were their horsemanship, their knowledge of terrain, their ability to appear, strike, and vanish. By choosing to defend fixed positions at Elandslaagte, they'd abandoned these advantages and instead played to British strengths: numerical superiority, artillery, coordinated infantry assault. The lesson should have been to avoid positional warfare, to maintain mobility, to refuse battle on British terms. And indeed, after Elandslaagte and other conventional defeats, the Boers would increasingly adopt guerrilla tactics that proved far more effective. Yet from a strategic perspective, Elandslaagte's significance was limited. Yes, the British had won a clear tactical victory. Yes, they'd retaken the railway station. Yes, they'd inflicted heavier casualties than they'd suffered. But what had really changed? Ladysmith remained threatened. Large Boer forces continued to operate in Natal. Within weeks, Ladysmith would be besieged anyway, the garrison trapped, the railway rendered useless. Elandslaagte bought time, boosted morale, demonstrated tactical competence, but it didn't alter the strategic situation fundamentally. This gap between tactical success and strategic impact is one of warfare's recurring themes. You can win battles and still lose wars. You can execute brilliant tactical maneuvers that accomplish nothing strategic. Elandslaagte was, in this sense, a microcosm of the larger British experience in the Boer War. Tactical competence often undermined by strategic confusion, individual victories that didn't add up to decisive success, a frustrating inability to translate battlefield success into political resolution. The battle also highlighted the human cost of even successful operations. Walk through any military cemetery from the Boer War, and you'll find the names of men who died at Elandslaagte. young men mostly, some barely out of their teens. They came from Scotland and England and Ireland, from farms and cities and small towns, enlisted for various reasons: patriotism, adventure, economic necessity, family tradition. They trained, shipped to South Africa, marched to Elandslaagte, and died there. Their families received terse official notifications. Their names were added to casualty lists published in newspapers. Their stories, the individual human narratives, were mostly lost to history. Consider one such soldier. We'll call him Private James Mackenzie of the Gordon Highlanders, though his name could have been anything. 22 years old, from a crofting family in the Highlands. He'd enlisted at 18, one of thousands of young Scots for whom the army represented regular pay and escape from poverty. He'd served 4 years before the war, had been stationed in India, had contracted malaria and recovered. He'd learned to soldier properly, could march all day with full kit, could shoot accurately, followed orders without question. At Elandslaagte, he'd climbed that slope toward the Boer positions, had felt bullets passing close, had seen friends fall beside him. He'd kept climbing, had reached the crest, had perhaps even engaged in hand-to-hand combat. He survived the battle. But 3 weeks later, during the siege of Ladysmith, he died of dysentery, one of thousands who succumbed to disease rather than enemy action. His grave is in Ladysmith Cemetery, marked with a simple military headstone. His family never saw his grave, could never visit, had only letters and memories. Multiply that story by tens of thousands, and you begin to grasp the human cost of the Boer War. The statistics become overwhelming, nearly 100,000 total deaths when you count all sides, British and Boer and African civilians. But statistics conceal as much as they reveal. Each death was individual, unique, mattered infinitely to families and friends. The widow left to raise children alone. The parents who lost their son. The children who grew up without fathers. These private griefs don't appear in strategic analyses or tactical studies, but they were the war's ultimate cost. The Boer casualties at Elandslaagte had their own stories. A farmer from the Transvaal, 40 years old, who'd left his wife and 4 children to fight for independence. He was shot during the British assault, wounded in the leg initially, then killed by a lance thrust during the pursuit. His body was buried in a mass grave. His effects returned to his family months later. His eldest son, 16, would take up his father's rifle and continue fighting. His widow would survive the war, but lose 2 children in a British concentration camp where Boer civilians were detained. Their farm would be burned as part of British scorched earth policy. The family's entire trajectory was altered by one October day at Elandslaagte. These human stories, British and Boer alike, resist easy moral categorization. Both sides believe they fought for just causes. British soldiers thought they served their empire, maintained order, spread civilization as they understood it. Boer fighters believed they defended their independence, their land, their way of life against imperial aggression. Both sides contained individuals of courage and individuals of cruelty, those who fought honorably and those who committed atrocities. War doesn't divide neatly into heroes and villains. It's more complex, more troubling than such simple binaries allow. The African experience of Elandslaagte and the broader war adds another layer of complexity often overlooked in histories focused on British and Boer. African laborers served both armies in non-combatant roles, driving wagons, tending animals, carrying supplies. They were present at Elandslaagte, were killed by stray bullets or shell fragments, were buried in unmarked graves if they were buried at all. Their stories are mostly lost. Colonial record-keeping didn't consider them important enough to document thoroughly. Yet they were there, caught up in a war between white powers fighting over land that had been taken from African peoples in the first place. The battle's commemoration began almost immediately, but would prove contested and complex. British forces erected a simple monument at Elandslaagte soon after the battle, commemorating their victory and their fallen, but after the war, in a South Africa moving toward union and eventual independence. How should Elandslaagte be remembered? For English-speaking South Africans, it could be remembered as a British victory in a war that, however problematic, was now past. For Afrikaners, it was a site of defeat and British brutality, particularly that cavalry pursuit. The same physical location carried radically different meanings depending on who was doing the remembering. As decades passed, Elandslaagte faded from popular consciousness in Britain. Other battles from the Boer War, Spion Kop, Mafeking, the sieges of Ladysmith and Kimberley, retained greater name recognition, often for the wrong reasons. Spion Kop was a disaster. Mafeking's siege was militarily insignificant but captured public imagination through propaganda. Elandslaagte, an actual tactical success, was largely forgotten outside military history circles. The British public, perhaps, didn't want to remember a war that had proven far more difficult and costly than expected, that had revealed uncomfortable truths about imperial power and its limits. In South Africa, memory proved more durable but divisive. Afrikaner nationalist historians, writing in the early to mid-20th century, portrayed Elandslaagte as an example of British military superiority based on numbers and brutality rather than skill. The cavalry pursuit received particular emphasis as evidence of British atrocities. These narratives served political purposes, helping to construct Afrikaner identity around victimhood and resistance to British imperialism. Whether historically accurate in every detail was less important than their emotional truth for a community defining itself through remembered suffering. Military historians have generally been more balanced, recognizing Elandslaagte as a competently executed combined arms action that achieved its tactical objectives at reasonable cost. It's studied in staff colleges as an example of coordination between different arms of service, of the importance of flanking movements, of aggressive leadership. The battle demonstrates what British forces could accomplish when properly led and coordinated, which makes the failure to consistently replicate such success elsewhere in the war all the more frustrating from a military historical perspective. The battlefield itself today is quiet farmland. The kopjes remain, weathered by more than a century of African sun and rain. A monument marks the site, though few visit. Local residents may not know the details of what occurred there in 1899, may view it simply as another battle from another war, relevant primarily to historians and descendants of participants. The physical landscape offers few clues to the violence it witnessed. The bullet-scarred rocks have long since been scattered or buried. The graves are maintained but inconspicuous. The railway station is long gone or transformed beyond recognition. Yet the battle's lessons remain relevant to military professionals. The fundamental principles demonstrated at Elandslaagte: combined arms coordination, the importance of reconnaissance and intelligence, the value of flanking maneuvers, the necessity of aggressive leadership, the challenge of maintaining command and control in combat. These principles transcend the specific technologies and tactics of 1899. Modern militaries study Elandslaagte not because lance charges remain relevant, but because the underlying tactical and operational challenges persist. The moral questions raised by the cavalry pursuit also remain relevant. When does legitimate military action cross the line into atrocity? How much force is justified in pursuit of military objectives? What duties do victors owe to defeated enemies? These questions have no simple answers, haven't been resolved in the century plus since Elandslaagte. They've recurred in every subsequent conflict, from World War I through contemporary wars. The specific circumstances change, but the underlying moral dilemmas persist. Consider also what Elandslaagte reveals about the nature of military innovation and organizational learning. The British forces that fought there demonstrated significant tactical competence, applied emerging doctrine about combined arms effectively, achieved a clear success. Yet this success wasn't consistently replicated in subsequent battles. Why? Partly because success depends on circumstances. Terrain, enemy dispositions, available forces all vary. But partly because military organizations learn slowly and inconsistently, because doctrine isn't uniformly understood or applied, because institutional culture and individual personalities matter enormously. The Boers, for their part, learned from Elandslaagte that conventional positional warfare played to British strengths. Their subsequent shift to guerrilla tactics, small mobile units striking at British communications and logistics, refusing to offer conventional battle, dispersing when pursued, proved far more effective. This adaptation demonstrated organizational learning of a high order. The Boers understood their strengths and weaknesses, understood British strengths and weaknesses, and adapted their strategy accordingly. That they ultimately lost the war had less to do with military effectiveness than with fundamental resource disparities and British willingness to escalate to scorched earth policies and civilian internment. The broader strategic context of Elandslaagte deserves reflection. The battle occurred during what historians call the opening phase of the Boer War, when both sides were still learning about each other, still developing effective tactics, still making fundamental strategic decisions about how the war would be fought. The Boers' initial strategy of rapid invasion aimed to achieve quick victories before British reinforcements arrived. This strategy had initial success but ultimately failed because Britain's resource advantages were simply too great. Elandslaagte was one data point, suggesting that Boer conventional military operations couldn't succeed against properly conducted British actions. Yet British strategy was equally flawed. The assumption that overwhelming force and conventional military victories would quickly end Boer resistance proved mistaken. Even after conventional Boer armies were defeated, after the main towns were occupied, after formal Boer governments surrendered, the war continued as a guerrilla conflict for years. British strategy had to evolve toward counterinsurgency, toward controlling territory rather than just defeating armies, toward denying guerrillas the support of the civilian population through concentration camps and farm burning. These policies worked militarily, but at enormous cost in human suffering and long-term political resentment. Elandslaagte, then, becomes a symbol of war's complexity and tragedy. It was a clear tactical victory achieved through competent planning and brave execution. It cost hundreds of lives on both sides. It demonstrated both the effectiveness of modern combined arms warfare and the brutal reality of modern firepower. It raised moral questions about the pursuit of defeated enemies that have no simple answers. It contributed to narratives of national identity on both sides that would shape South African politics for generations. And strategically, it changed very little. The war continued, the suffering continued. The fundamental issues that caused the war remained unresolved by military action. Why should we remember Elandslaagte today, more than 125 years after the battle? Not because it was the largest battle of the Boer War. It wasn't. Not because it was the most strategically significant. It wasn't that either. Not because it provides simple moral lessons. It doesn't. We should remember it because it encapsulates so much about warfare, about human behavior under extreme stress, about the gap between tactical and strategic success, about the moral complexity of violence, even in pursuit of legitimate military objectives. We should remember it because real people fought there, suffered there, died there. Private Mackenzie and his Highland comrades, climbing that slope under fire, displaying courage that deserves recognition even if we question the cause they served. The Boer farmer defending what he believed was his homeland, fighting bravely for independence even if his society was built on racial oppression. General Koch, the German volunteer, dying for a cause that wasn't originally his own, but that he'd adopted. The African laborers caught in crossfire of a war between white powers. All of these people, all of their stories deserve to be remembered not as propaganda for any cause, but as human beings caught up in events larger than themselves. We should remember Elandslaagte because military history is ultimately about choices, The choice to go to war, the choice of how to fight, the choice of how to treat enemies and non-combatants, the choice of when to pursue peace. Those choices have consequences. And the consequences at Elandslaagte included hundreds dead and wounded, families destroyed, hatreds deepened, a war that would drag on for nearly 3 more years with escalating brutality. Understanding those choices and their consequences might help us make better choices in our own time. The kopjes outside Elandslaagte station stand today much as they stood in October 1899. The geography hasn't changed. The same rocky heights, the same slopes, the same veldt stretching to the horizon. But the men who fought for those kopjes are long gone. Dust, their voices silent. What remains is their story, if we choose to tell it honestly. Not as simple heroism or simple villainy, not as uncomplicated triumph or unambiguous tragedy, but as complex human drama, where brave men on both sides fought and died for causes they believed just, where tactical competence coexisted with strategic confusion, where military necessity shaded into moral atrocity, where individual courage couldn't resolve fundamental political conflicts. On October 21st, 1899, 3,500 British soldiers attacked a Boer position at Elandslaagte. They coordinated artillery, infantry, and cavalry effectively. They flanked the enemy position, pressed home their assault despite heavy casualties, broke Boer resistance, and pursued the defeated enemy vigorously, perhaps too vigorously. They achieved a clear tactical victory. They retook a railway station. They killed or captured nearly half the defending force. They proved that British arms, properly employed, could defeat Boer commandos in open battle. And yet. 3 weeks later, Ladysmith was besieged anyway. The war continued for nearly 3 more years. Tens of thousands more died. Soldiers, civilians, children in concentration camps. The railway station at Elandslaagte changed hands, was fought over again, eventually became irrelevant. The tactical victory, so hard won, ultimately meant little strategically. The individual courage displayed by men on both sides couldn't overcome the fundamental futility of trying to resolve complex political disputes through violence. This is what Elandslaagte teaches us, if we're willing to learn. Victory is more complex than winning battles. Courage doesn't make causes just. Tactical competence doesn't ensure strategic success. And the human cost of war, measured not in statistics but in individual lives destroyed, families shattered, communities traumatized. This cost is always higher than we imagine beforehand, always more tragic than any military achievement can justify. The Gordon Highlander who survived the assault, who climbed that slope under fire and reached the crest, did he think it was worth it? Did the victory justify watching his comrades fall? Did the campaign justify his own probable death from disease months later? We can't know. He left no memoir, no diary, just a name on a casualty list and a grave in South Africa. But perhaps the question itself matters more than any answer. Perhaps simply asking whether victory was worth the cost, whether military success justified the human suffering, whether there might have been alternatives to violence. Perhaps asking these questions honestly is how we honor those who fought at Elandslaagte and in every war. The sun sets over the kopjes near Elandslaagte, painting the rocks in shades of amber and gold, just as it did on October the 21st, 1899. The earth remembers what happened there, holds the bones of those who fell, carries forward the consequences of that October day. And we, living in a different century but facing similar questions about when war is justified and how it should be fought, we remember too. Or we should. Because forgetting Elandslaagte, forgetting the complexity and tragedy and moral ambiguity of that battle, forgetting the real human beings who suffered there, that would be the final betrayal of everyone who was there. British and Boer and African, victor and vanquished, survivor and casualty alike. Remember Elandslaagte. Remember it clearly, honestly, with all its complexity. Remember that brave men fought there for causes they believed in. Remember that the victory was real but costly. Remember that tactical success didn't ensure strategic wisdom. Remember that every casualty was someone's son or brother or father or husband. Remember that war, even when necessary, even when competently conducted, even when victorious, is ultimately about human suffering. Remember, and perhaps, having remembered, choose more wisely than the men of 1899 chose. The story of Elandslaagte is over. The men who fought there are silent. But their story continues to speak to us, if we listen, about courage and folly, victory and tragedy, the terrible complexity of war and the enduring question of whether any military triumph can ever truly justify its human cost. That question echoes across the years, across the copies, across the graves, demanding our answer. What answer will we give?